Good afternoon, everybody. I'm James Zemaitis. I'm the Director of Museum Relations at the New York Gallery R & Company, and I'm coming to you live once again from my bedroom in Mendham, New Jersey, for my second Zoom discussion in an ongoing series with American museums about groundbreaking design exhibitions of the past and present. Today, we are celebrating the 20th anniversary of the landmark exhibition, Aluminum by Design, Jewelry to Jets, which opened at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh on October 28th, 2000. The show traveled to the Cooper Hewitt, Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, the Wilsonian, who in particular loaned numerous pieces to the exhibition, Cranbrook, the Design Museum in London, and venues in Brussels and Paris, a tour that lasted nearly 4 years. I was fortunate enough to see the show in New York, Miami Beach, and Cranbrook, and in the 20 years since, the exhibition catalog has been one of the Bibles in my design library. If you don't already own this incredible book, the Carnegie Museum has just located copies of it from deep inside a warehouse on the Allegheny River, which it can sell directly to you for just $24.99. There's the book. It is a Bible. It is incredible. That's $50 off the original list price. And all proceeds will benefit the museum, of course. And we will provide you with that information in the recap of this Zoom presentation. You can view it on our website and on the Carnegie's website afterwards. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Carnegie, they have one of the top design collections in North America, including, in my opinion, the finest chair collection outside of Vitra. And they have incredibly deep collections of 19th, 20th, and 21st century design, which are often intertwined with the history of Pittsburgh industry, such as obviously aluminum, but also steel and glass. And when we eventually reopen museums across America, I encourage everyone to consider a road trip to Pittsburgh, as the Carnegie Museum is blessed with considerable space to show off their permanent design collection, including many of the masterworks that you will see on screen today. A technical note for today's discussion: if you want to ask a question that we will try and take at the end of this 1 hour session, please submit it via the Q&A button and not the chat button. I messed that up last time. Now, I would like to introduce the curator of the Aluminum exhibition, Sarah Nichols, coming to you live from London, where she has one of the best Zoom backdrops I have seen to date. Classic works of Italian glass from her collection, including what appears to be Thomas Stearns on the far right and Fulvio Bianconi on the left. Sarah was a curator at the Carnegie for nearly 25 years, rising through the ranks to become chief curator in 1996. Sarah received her undergraduate art history degree from the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England, which plywood geeks like myself make pilgrimages to, since it houses the Jack Pritchard Isacon archives. And then Sarah moved to America, where she received her master's from the legendary Winterthur program of American Culture at the University of Delaware. After Sarah retired from active duty at the Carnegie in 2006, she completed one final major exhibition at the museum on the Venetian and American collaborations of the studio glass movement, and then she returned to England. Our other panelist is Rachel Delphia, the Alan G. and Jane A. Lehman Curator of Decorative Arts and Design at the Carnegie. Rachel also received her MA from Winterthur, and I first met her about 15 years ago during an exhibition she organized on George Nakashima's Pittsburgh Commissions. She has curated both historical exhibitions, such as the 2015 show From Silver to Steel, the Modern Designs of Peter Muller-Monk, as well as exhibitions on contemporary designers, including Sebastian Arazzuri and an upcoming show she's planning on Sharif Bey. Now, to quote Sarah from her opening wall label in the Aluminum exhibition, "From jewelry to jets, aluminum profoundly influenced life in the 20th century. Its wide-ranging uses and unique combinations of properties are unmatched by any other modern material. Aluminum is equally at home today in industry and the artist's studio. The metal's history is as varied as its application," she writes. "Once considered precious enough for jewelry and ceremonial objects for royalty, aluminum is, in fact, the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust, but it does not occur in nature in a usable form and is difficult to isolate. So Sarah, let's start with you. First things first, as we have an international audience watching us here, since you are a British citizen and now live in London after many years in the States, what is with the European spelling and pronunciation of aluminum as aluminium, which is something I've been working on for 20 years and I still can't
Very good, yeah.
Is there an official history of this?
There isn't, but you can glean things from historical documents connected to companies. Obviously, the first material was isolated in France. Aluminum was first isolated in France. So I'm going to give a little bit of a sort of second half of the 19th century history of aluminum while I answer your question. In France, it was known as aluminium, keeping in with all elements having IUM at the end, because it was isolated using a chemical process. Initially, the amounts of aluminum that you could produce were minute, so it tended to be used for extravagant pieces, extravagant in terms of expensive, you know, jewelry, small little bibelots, but very expensive. And so on the screen is a bracelet made out of aluminum, but at this period they were often combined with precious materials like gold, and then connected with royalty as well. Napoleon III was a great proponent of aluminum. He thought that it would answer a lot of economic problems in France and could possibly be used in warfare, etc., etc. And so the piece on the right is a wonderful centerpiece designed by Christoffel and given to Napoleon III to sort of celebrate his support of the material. But obviously nothing was really going to happen with this material until you could produce it in vast quantities. And that happened in sort of 1886, when two people totally independently of each other, Charles Martin Hall in the United States and Paul Héroult in France, discovered the electrolytic method of making aluminium at that point. And here you have, well, I'll talk about this a bit later. So with this electrolytic process, you could suddenly produce vast quantities of the material. And Hall took his patent to a group of Pittsburgh metallurgists and businessmen who decided to form a company to promote this material, make and promote this material. And that was established in 1888, the Pittsburgh Reduction Company. And we have, and at this point, I should say, both spellings occur in America with the I and without the I, and both are considered correct. But in the July 1888 minutes of the Pittsburgh Reduction Company, both spellings are used. But a year later in their minutes, there's a note saying, resolved that the name of our product be laid over for 1 week to decide which we shall adopt, aluminum or aluminium. Now, unfortunately, there's no other notes, but clearly they adopted the spelling without the second I. There was a sort of apocryphal story that in fact it was a printer's mistake. You know, the printer was going to print some material for the company, and the I popped out of being one of the letter plates, and he just went ahead and produced it without the I, and that stuck. But the minutes seem to imply that it was a more conscious decision. And then there's a wonderful note in a lecture of 1891 by a noted authority on the material, and he discusses the issue, and he says that he prefers the European way, but he tells a story about an American company called the Cowles Electrical Smelting and Aluminium Company. So that's when it was established legally a few years before that. It had the I in it, but they went to court, which they had to because this was a legal name, to change the name legally to spelling aluminium without the second I. And the reason they gave, which I just think is fabulous, it was because the writing of the extra I and especially the dotting of it became such an insufferable burden and expense. They wanted to spell it without the second I. So whether that's true or not, who knows? But anyway, once the Aluminum Company of America had decided to spell it without the second I, that's stuck in the States. So, and I should just talk about, because I think you want to talk about this object as well, James. These are the first globules of aluminum produced by Charles Martin Hall's methods. And you can see there's tiny amounts of the material were produced initially. And these are owned by Alcoa. And actually they're known as the crown jewels in the company. And then they had this box specially made for them, which is a box totally appropriate for crown jewels.
I only wanted to say it because I went to Oberlin College, and I actually, when I was a student, I lived down next door to Charles Martin Hall's house, because that's where he was from. He's a revered figure in our school. So I think you have a slide with binoculars too. I want to see what that is there.
Well, once the electrolytic process was established, you could produce aluminum in vast quantities. So it stopped being a precious material. People stopped making jewelry from it, stopped making centerpieces to give to emperors from it. And they started making, in essence, well, as you can see on the right-hand side, giveaway things, this little tray. And then the binoculars are wonderful because they are folding binoculars. And those were made for military purposes. So Napoleon III was quite right that aluminum did end up with great military importance.
That's amazing. You've been slowly acquiring aluminum, of course, Sarah, over the years for the museum in the same way that a curator at Corning or Toledo would specialize in collecting glass. Or was it more random than that? And if so, was there an aha moment,
Well, the aha moment was the exhibition. The first, I suppose, consciously collected object made out of aluminum was collected by my predecessor, curator of decorative arts, Philip Johnston. And this is the Francis and Margaret MacDonald picture frame, which is made out of aluminum. When Philip came to the museum in let's get my decades right here, sorry, 1982, not 1982. The museum hardly collected in the 20th century or 19th century and 20th century at all, and Philip changed that. And he collected primarily in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so, he was thrilled to find this piece by the MacDonald sisters, which was, is a fabulous addition to the collection, but it just happened to be made of aluminum. So which was an added extra to it. But this is the sort of thing he would have been looking for the collection, regardless of whether it was aluminum or not. And it was just, as I say, an added plus that it was aluminum. And in fact, because it was, we were able to go to the Hunt Foundation. The Hunt family is one of the founding families of Alcoa, and they helped purchase this for the museum because it was aluminum. But really, after that, we didn't collect aluminum much at all until the exhibition started and really took shape. So
right.
And we were collecting, on a massive scale and quickly with the show in mind. We collected. The total focus was on the exhibition. We collected for the exhibition because as it ended up being a 7-venue, nearly 4-year tour, we would have had a tough time. Might have had a tough time to find people to lend for that long.
Rachel, take us through a couple of these coming up here. Yeah, the classic Breuer chaise, and then the next one as well, which again, the Carnegie was always so ahead of the curve in terms of some of these acquisitions. The Charlotte Parian cabinet built by Jean Prouvé for the Mexique dormitories. I think there's 5 or 6 of these in museums now, but this was the first one acquired by an American museum. Rachel, you have located some of the original exhibition photographs. And as with so many museum exhibitions in this kind of, almost, still pre-pure digital era at the Millennium, one or two vignettes, such as the Airstream trailer, which was parked in the courtyard, were not actually photographed, but many were. And take us on a visual tour of this exhibition.
Sure. Yeah, actually, it's very funny. Delving into the archives really makes you appreciate the assets that we have today. And of course, we think nothing of documenting an exhibition today with hundreds of high resolution digital photographs. But we have about 40 good shots of this show taken on film. They're very nice, but that was what we did 20 years ago. And I did have to get special permission to go into the museum to scan these. So I hope everyone enjoys this virtual throwback tour. So yes, as James and Sarah have said, this exhibition really looked at the profound and wide-ranging impact of aluminum, both on design and everyday life across the 19th and 20th century. And it was divided into 4 main sections. So the first section was called Inventing Aluminum, and this looked at those 2 processes that Sarah was talking about, first a chemical process, and then later an electrolytic process that allowed aluminum to be produced in quantities that were suitable for commercial production. So in the earlier period, we had wonderful precious objects like some of the ones Sarah showed you. I also love on the wall behind this, you can see the graphics. It says approximate price comparisons. And so we can see, for instance, that in 1854, aluminum was $272 a pound compared to 77 cents a pound the year this exhibition opened in 2000. And so then after that electrolytic process developed in France and in the US, as we've heard, there was a new problem, a solution without a problem, right? So you have aluminum, which was really a scientific discovery, and now you have this material, so what do you do with it? And so there were a lot of early uses where aluminum was tried as a substitute. Let's use aluminum instead of wood, let's use aluminum instead of leather, and then also imitative functions. And I'll just point out these chairs in the middle of the screen, which I love. This Rococo Revival chair in solid aluminum, and then the chair next to it, which has aluminum looking like tooled leather. The next major exhibition, or major section of the exhibition, sorry, was called the Modernist Ideal. And this looked at the machine age, really the period between the 2 world wars, when aluminum production worldwide had ramped up considerably. So there was a lot more volume and a lot more availability for it to be included in all kinds of consumer products. But this section also looked at the idea of aluminum and how aluminum really started to embody modernity and a kind of positive vision of the future. So this section had 5 sub-themes. So we looked at architecture. This was a lot of grills, windows, balusters, lighting fixtures. And this was both standalone lighting devices, but also things that were built in to architectural settings. Trains, planes, automobiles, and Airstream trailers, the transportation section. Wonderful engines, propeller blades, struts. And I love this picture of the Airstream at the bottom right with a famous French cyclist pulling it, because of course it was so lightweight that a cyclist could pull it. Then there was a section looking at designers and the way that many of the world's leading designers at the time experimented with aluminum and pushed its uses forward. So here you see the Parian bookshelf, as well as work by Frank Lloyd Wright and Garrett Rietveld.
I mean, that's an outrageous slide. I mean,
and the Kiesler, the Kiesler table is kind of hiding there. You can't see it very well in the shot.
I mean, then you have the Eileen Gray cabinet behind it. The Rietveld is one of 2 known prototypes of him working in aluminum. I mean, it's incredible.
Yeah, no, this is a great moment. And then the last section in this Modernist Ideal was about the home. And so this looked especially at objects, how aluminum and modern aluminum came into the home through objects like tea kettles and also through appliances like vacuum And the third section of the exhibition was called Competition and Conflict. And this looked particularly at the post-World War II era, and both international competition and conflict, but also competition and conflict within nations. So of course, as aluminum industries had developed separately in different countries over the in various countries over the early 20th century, and a lot of that production had really ramped up during the Second World War. Countries had their own aluminum industry and saw aluminum as part of their national identity and part of their national story. So we look at a certain amount of nationalism in this section, and then also at promotion and promotional strategies that became necessary as there was greater competition. So Alcoa, for instance, developed a famous program in 1957 called Forecast that was really about broadcasting a certain exciting new vision of aluminum. And we'll talk a little bit more about the tables at the bottom left by Noguchi that are part of that. And then the last part of this section was something called Material Wars. And this looked at aluminum in contrast to other emergent and developing materials, things like plastics and fiberglass. So for instance, what material was going to win out for prepackaged beverages? What material was going to win out for certain sporting equipment? And so there were a lot of kind of compare and contrast of material uses in this Material Wars section. And then the final section of the exhibition was called Crossing Boundaries, and this looked at the recent past, recent from the year 2000, and particularly at how aluminum crossed into all different design disciplines, from fashion to jewelry to furniture to the automotive industry, experimental textiles, robotics, you name it. And that's where we left the story in 2000.
Well, Rachel, let's move on to the next slide here, which I asked you to put in. Because as I mentioned in the introduction, the aluminum exhibition, well, it played a huge formative role in my career and in many other market people and curatorial people careers, as it took place for me just as I was putting together my first auction of design at Phillips in New York, and seeing the sculptural qualities of both a meat slicer or a vacuum cleaner like you have there, or the Lockheed Lounge, which we just saw a hint of in the previous slide, and seeing them as part of the history of this material in the same show, it changed my professional life. And in particular, it was seeing some of the same 1930s modernist designs included in both the aluminum exhibition as well as the American Modern exhibition organized by the Met of John Waddell's collection. These two works here were also in that show at the Met, which opened 20 years ago this past week. It made me realize how the display and photography of the industrial design in these two exhibitions and their catalogs could have a lasting impact on the commercial market, especially at auction, which in turn led to more collectors, such as George Kravis, and more institutions collecting these works as well. Rachel, you were studying industrial design as an undergraduate at Carnegie Mellon, which is right down the street from the museum, when Sarah was organizing the exhibition. How did this show change your life?
So, yes, well, this is me wearing an N95 mask on the far right and carving a block of blue foam with my classmate, Lisa Alba. This was in the sophomore industrial design studio at Carnegie Mellon. And if I recall, we are working on a prototype head for a concept for a robotic assistant. But the funny thing about this photograph, and I can't believe I found it because this is one of about 10 digital photographs that I have from the year 2000. This was taken October 29th, 2000. So this is what I was doing the day after Aluminum by Design opened. Yes, I was a design student, and I had the privilege of meeting Sarah fairly early on. She was a guest critic in some of our classes, particularly our furniture design class. So I really enjoyed meeting her then. Of course, never knowing the way that our paths would continue to cross professionally in subsequent years. So as James said, the museum is right down the street. Andrew Carnegie founded both institutions. And so as young designers, we were really, really, really excited about this exhibition. And so just a couple of notes. On the left, this Heller hostessware designed by Belle Kogan was actually lent to the exhibition by a man named Craig Vogel. And Craig was also one of the essayists for the catalog, but Craig was also my design history professor at Carnegie Mellon. So there were lots of connections. And then in the middle, I snagged this shot, which I could not find in our own archives, from a website awarding an exhibition design award to Bally Design. And Bally Design was and is a big design firm in Pittsburgh, and they were the exhibition designers for the project. And so I remember going on a special tour that was organized for us students by the designers. And so my first view through this show was actually thinking about it in terms of exhibitions design. And they did win some awards for it from a graphic design agency. But I think one thing I'll point out is the wonderful aluminum ribbon that was suspended by the ceiling. And this through all 4 galleries and kind of traced your path through it. But the big takeaway for me was this, this show was absolutely eye-opening because I grew up in the Midwest. We went to regional museums, but, I didn't even go to New York until I was 16. So I had not had a lot of opportunity to see design and decorative arts in museums. And so a huge light bulb went off in my head when I saw this project. And it's fair to say that if it were not for this, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today. This definitely launched my interest in a career in museums, but specifically working with design. So
you and me both. Sarah, several of the designs acquired by the museum for the exhibition have acquired legendary status in the collecting community because of their scarcity, their value, and overall sort of holy grail status. In particular, I'm thinking of this incredible pair of Noguchi prismatic tables showing here on the left. A few years later, a second pair were discovered by a dealer in a different colorway of purple and bronze and sold separately at auction for astronomical prices, one with Richard Wright in Chicago and one with me at Sotheby's in New York. The one seen in the period Alcoa Forecast Program advertisement on the right has never been found. Tell us the story about how these tables entered the collection.
Okay. Well, the Forecast Program it was clearly an incredibly important advertising campaign for Alcoa, but also a really interesting design moment. They hired some of the best known designers in America to design objects that they would then have an advertising campaign about. So there was never really any intention these things would necessarily go into production. I mean, they might, but in fact, practically everything, I don't really think much in the Forecast Program, if anything, has gone into production. A few objects exist because they must have needed being photographed. Needed to be photographed. So anyway, Alcoa contacted Noguchi. They'd already had a relationship with Noguchi because he'd used aluminum in some of his sculptures. He'd actually done a design, I think sort of 3 years earlier than this, for something that he called skin-stressed furniture. I mean, it literally is a sketch on a note on the back of an envelope. And there's no indication that that should be made out of aluminum, but clearly he used that design and had it made out of aluminum. And the idea was that these objects could be painted, which the ones that we have are, or anodized. And I have to say, looking at the advertisement, that looks as though that could be anodized aluminum. Whereas
the ones that came up on the market in 2005, 2006 were anodized as well.
Okay. Well, these are painted. One of the great things about the aluminum show for Pittsburgh was how everybody sort of got on board with it. I mean, I would give lectures around town. There were a lot of collectors in town. There were a lot of people who'd worked for Alcoa, still around in town, and actually connected to the museum. I mean, we'd had Hunts, who are trustees and still do, who are trustees of the museum. Anyway, and because the exhibition was funded by Alcoa Foundation, there were very close links with with the company, and the company was very helpful in sort of putting us in touch with people if we needed to be. And Torrance Hunt, Senior, was around in Pittsburgh then, and he had worked for Alcoa. He was one of the Hunt family member who had worked for the company in the 50s and had been involved in the Alcoa forecast program, and he took these home. And in fact, interestingly, I don't think regarded them necessarily particularly highly. They were sort of out on the porch and they were used to put cocktails on, and then I think they might have had them by the swimming pool or whatever. So anyway, through Alcoa and our knowledge of the Hunts, we found these tables still in the possession of Torrance Hunt. He very kindly lent them to the exhibition, and then very kindly gave them to the museum, as I see, in 2004 after the exhibition was over. So
I keep hoping that the other ones will be found. You know, it's like we have the two that were then found outside of DC, I think it was, and then who knows where, you know, the others are residing in somebody's backyard.
But
let's move on to
not necessarily a lot of them went into production, and in fact if you look at the ad, I mean, I suspect that the image at the bottom is a graphic design, not necessarily a real table. So
right.
There might not be many out there. I mean, it'd be wonderful if there were, but
oh, absolutely. Let's move on to another trophy, and of course the Carnegie Museum is the only North American institution to own the most famous design of the second half of the 20th century, and certainly the most valuable on the collecting market from that time, Magnussen's Lockheed Lounge, designed in 1985. Just months before you acquired your example, Sarah, there was one available in a Christie's London auction. I'm holding up the catalog, the chair, their second sale, and it failed to sell for just $60,000. 6 years later, one would sell with me at Sotheby's for $1 million, and now they sell for several times that at auction. Timing is everything, isn't it? Tell us about the acquisition of this work and another incredible Magnussen piece, which is frequently actually overlooked in the Carnegie's collection, the Orgone chair.
Okay. I should also say that we also have a bicycle by Magnussen in the collection as well. But this piece, so I was, over a number of years while I was working on the show, I was building up my checklist for what I wanted in the show. And one of the things I wanted in the show was Magnussen's Lockheed Lounge, because it sort of, well, I just think it's a fabulous piece of design, but it really illustrated a sort of appropriation from one industry to another. And interestingly, whereas a lot of the appropriation happens at a sort of very high technical level, you have sort of things like superplastic aluminum and honeycomb aluminum developed for the aerospace industry that then are picked up by the designers. Instead of being futuristic, this is really a nostalgic sort of look back at appropriation, because obviously it is reminiscent, because it's called the Lockheed Lounge, it's reminiscent of the Lockheed aeroplane, and there's the way that the panels of aluminum abut to create the skin of the airplane and are riveted, and that's what Magnussen has done here. So I knew I wanted to have a Lockheed Lounge in the exhibition. I didn't think that I would be able to find anyone who would lend us one, particularly for a 4-year run of the exhibition. So at this point, I had been working with this wonderful man, Keith Johnson of Urban Architecture, who I would just present him with wish lists and he would find them. So I said I wanted a Lockheed Lounge, and lo and behold, he came up with one. And I don't know, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if it isn't the one that was in the London auction, because it came from London. It came from the UK. So
and of course, if it was that one, which we're still trying to figure out, then it was actually, this is the one that Madonna used in her video.
Oh, even better.
12 for rain.
Make a note, Rachel, for the fire. That would be fabulous if that was the case.
Amazing.
So I don't know. So we were able to acquire one. And although I mean, I'm not going to mention prices, but we certainly paid under five figures for it. Not under 5 figures, 5 figures for it. You know, it was an expensive acquisition for us. So I was somewhat with trepidation as I went to Richard Armstrong, who's the then director, to say that, you know, I'd found one of these and I wanted to buy it. But it really was this price that we'd sort of never paid for a piece of contemporary design before. And luckily he was fully on board with it.
Oh,
So,
and then you ordered the orgone directly from the studio, right?
That's right. We wanted to include the orgone chair in the show because, again, as a sort of an appropriation, this is really panel beating skills. Aluminum was very important for the automotive industry very early on, and initially then it was bodywork. So there were panel beaters who were expert at working with aluminum. And this is the method, this is the technique that's used in the construction of this piece. And so we must have we were in contact with Magnussen. And basically at this stage, the edition had not been sold out. So, and because it was an expensive chair to produce and took a long time to produce, they only made for the edition as people wanted to buy one. So
right.
they made it for us.
Absolutely.
And one of these things that just turned up just in time to go in. It was touch and go whether we'd actually get it in time to put it in the exhibition, but we did. So.
And Sarah, of course, you continued to acquire works for the Carnegie's permanent collection after the exhibition opened, sort of filling pieces in gaps that you had borrowed from other museums, which is actually how I met you, because you acquired a couple things from me at Phillips. And then you were succeeded by Jason Bush, who is now the director of the American Folk Art Museum, who sought out new aluminum masterworks for the World's Fair exhibition that he organized with Catherine Futter of the Nelson Atkins at the time. And then Rachel, you continued to build the museum's aluminum collection from thenceforth on. Tell us about a few of these historical works that you've acquired, and if these were, how you were influenced in terms of acquiring them, from this show or any other exhibitions that were being done in the wake of the aluminum show at other museums.
Yeah, well, I think it's funny when we visit exhibitions at museums. It's often it's often difficult to tell, or a little bit secondary to think about where everything came from, right? And so I think sometimes people might assume that everything in an exhibition belongs to a museum, and of course it rarely does, unless that's part of the purpose of the show. And so there were many wonderful things that Sarah borrowed that we didn't acquire. And so one of the things that Jason and then I have been able to do is fill some of those holes, some of those chapters where we really, really loved something from the exhibition and saw how important it would be long-term for the collection. And so on the left is the centerpiece that Sarah talked about, which was given to Emperor Napoleon III. And then on the right, this came about during Jason Bush's tenure. I mean, I was at the museum too, but he was the department head. And this is directly modeled after the original that was given to the emperor. And this was made for a financier in Paris, and who was very heavily invested in the aluminum industry. His hotel. But one of the things that's really fun when you look at these side by side, the forms are the same. Clearly they've done the same castings, but true to that adage that they were trying to figure out what aluminum could do, the piece that we borrowed from Compiègne is maybe imitating silver and also using gold. The piece on the right has a patina that's imitating bronze. So it's really interesting to compare. This was exciting for us because when we looked at that very early moment of these early precious aluminum objects, the only thing that remained in the Carnegie's collection was the bracelet, which is wonderful but small.
Right.
This was a great addition. Another object is this aluminum bronze. So aluminum was alloyed with copper to create a gold-colored bronze. And on the left is a series of these little spoons that was included in Sarah's exhibition. And on the right, a whole service made by the same maker that Jason found to acquire for us. a little bit more contemporary, but Ali Tayyar, the Turkish-born designer and architect who was practicing in New York, and at the time the show was coming together, Sarah had reached out to some colleagues and kind of seeking architects who were doing some exciting things with aluminum at that moment in the late 90s, and Ali Tayyar late 30s, almost 40 at this time. And so we had this prototype chair on the right in the exhibition, as well as a screen, some shelving, a number of pieces. But when he sadly passed away a couple years ago, we had an opportunity through the estate to acquire another work. So the screen, which was originally designed for the Plaza Hotel in Washington, DC, the screen came to us quite recently.
Yeah, the screen is still up there, the original one as well. You can visit it at the hotel. And I just love how that screen, you know, there's all of those echoes of the earlier modernist designs in the collection that we looked at before, like Rietveld and Prouvé, for sure.
Yeah, oh yeah, with the circles. And this is modular, so it comes apart and there's these little plastic clips. It's wonderful. Another area where we've really been able to bring the collection for women designers and also in craftspeople. So these were also acquired during Jason's tenure, these wonderful spun aluminum covered bowls by Marie Zimmerman, a really important American metalsmith, but it was quite rare for her to work in aluminum. Most of her work is in other metals, a lot of copper. And so these are really, really wonderful. And then Greta Magnussen Grossman, and this was something, James, that we were able to work on together, the wonderful Cobra lamp, which came from your gallery. And you know, this is also a place where we were carrying the story forward somewhat. On the left, you see a photograph also from Alcoa's forecast program, and this was an oven that Greta had designed for the forecast program. So we actually acquired a series of photographs, 8 by 10 glossy photographs at the time of the exhibition. So we already had the photograph, but we didn't have any of her three-dimensional work. So it was exciting to add the lamp.
And I will say, if I may interrupt for 1 second too, which is funny, we have copies of all the promotional photographs in our Greta Grossman archives in our gallery, but we did not know if the actual oven existed or not. And in that same sort of way, like, you know, even less so than the Noguchi tables, did it ever exist? Were there any out there? And I'm happy to note that actually in the last couple of months, a distant relation of Greta's in England has this. So hopefully we'll be getting it and being able to present it in person at some point.
That's exciting. Another wonderful lamp. This is by Zahara Schatz, and she was one of a small handful of designers who were selected for a juried show at MoMA in 1951 called New Lamps, and then a subset of the lamps were put into production. And, so she's an Israeli-American designer, and this is a wonderful lamp from 1951. And then there's, you know, I mentioned we're not quite sure when we go through a show what belongs to the museum and what might have been borrowed. Even though it's written on the label, we can't hold all that information in our head. And James, you and I storage at your gallery about 3 years ago, and I saw this on a lower shelf, and I remember kind of chiding you, James, why didn't you tell me that you had this? And you looked at me and said, you already have one. And I said, no, we didn't. We borrowed it from the Wolfsonian. Yeah, so this was also an exciting addition to the collection. You mentioned exhibitions and Jason collecting some aluminum and certainly exhibiting a lot of aluminum in Inventing the Modern World, our World's Fair exhibition in 2012. Our 2015 project, Silver to Steel, also gave us an opportunity to collect some aluminum. So this is a press camera, the super graphic camera by Graflex. And this was kind of the state-of-the-art model that was used by a lot of press photographers at the time. And Peter Muller Monk Associates took that from a mahogany leather-covered body to an all-aluminum case. And so you can see the cross-promotion, this long-standing theme, which was also in the exhibition, of aluminum, of manufacturers of a material like aluminum and industrial designers kind of working together and co-promoting each other's work. So on the left is an ad that ran in Fortune and also in Industrial Design magazine in 1959 by Alcoa that shows the parts of this camera.
It's amazing. Well, I have a final question for the two of you really to answer. I'll start with Rachel, and then we'll see if we can get a question or two in. In her Aluminum by Design catalog essay, Paola Antonelli of MoMA wrote about how aluminum at the dawn of the 21st century became, in her words, one of the mutant materials of contemporary design, in that it was often disguised to look like something it wasn't, because of the advent of new technology which allowed this to happen. And one example which always comes to mind, of course, is Philippe Starck's stool that we see here, which I honestly used to think was plastic. In the 2 decades since the exhibition has opened, is Paola's thesis still in play, or have there been exciting new developments that have pushed boundaries in other directions? And what of these recent designs, if any, have entered the Carnegie's collection?
Yeah, so it's funny. I think her thesis is absolutely still in play, and I think aluminum and any other number of materials still perform in that way. But I think as it happens, the objects that we have acquired more recently in contemporary design and aluminum have almost done the reverse. Like their aluminumness is kind of laid and the really innovative, exciting aspects of them come more in either the concept, as in the case with the Campana screen here, which is made of television antennas, or in the fabrication techniques. And, for instance, Joris Laarman, a Dutch designer who is very, very hot right now. And Joris has done a lot of work really experimenting with fabrication techniques. So on the left is a detail of the Vortex console. This is an object in the Carnegie's collection. It's a 14-foot wide bookcase. But this is designed using software that models fluid dynamics. And you just press pause when the waves look a certain pleasing way, and then he laser cuts and laminates the aluminum. And then on the right is another object I wish we'd acquired. This one is in the National Gallery of Victoria, but this is called microstructures, and Laarman is using a 3D printer, but also an algorithm that changes the density of the way the aluminum is laid down depending on the structural requirements of the particular part of the chair. But they're both blatantly aluminum. And then I think 2 other examples along this line, including a very recent acquisition on the left here. This is the Thomas Heatherwick extrusion. So Heatherwick had been excited for a number of years about the idea of being able to create seating furniture by shoving a billet of aluminum through a die, much like a Play-Doh fun factory. But the limiting factor had to do with the strength and the size of the press required. And so finally, about 10 years ago, he was able to do that. So you imagine this die shaped like an A, and they just push the aluminum through and get this long bench, and then he slices it into pieces. And that becomes one of these extrusions. And then the other object you're seeing here is Matthias Bankston. This is called the slice chair, and this is laser cut aluminum in several hundred layers that create these beautiful contours. So again, I think these are more about kind of exploring fabrication techniques and about new technologies that made them possible, but not as much about the aluminum itself changing or adapting.
And of course, he did that in plywood as well.
On what?
He did that in plywood as well. So I was always wondering if you had to, like, plywood, aluminum, which one do I get? Because they're both so extraordinary, really.
Yeah, this is my favorite example of aluminum being something else. This is from early in the exhibition, and of course, formally, the aluminum is being wood with turned spindles, and then especially on the coat rack, it's even faux grained.
Yeah, that's outrageous. We actually have some really good questions that have come in too here.
Yeah.
And we have like 9 minutes to answer a couple. And the first one is going to go to Sarah. It has been written here by Shoshana at the Wilsonian, one of the curators down there. She writes, "I'm struck by the exhibition design of the show, which is clearly inspired by the material in a way that's clean and communicative. How did the design for the show come together, and how did it evolve from venue to venue?"
So, well, every venue was different, and I should say the traveling show was much smaller than the show that we had, which was huge. We worked very closely with the designers over the show. And because they were Pittsburgh based, we could do that sort of easily. There was a lot of communication, and we were very keen to the flow of the show and the look of the show should reflect the material, and particularly with that ribbon that goes through, which also was used for labeling. As you see it, the names of the sections are on it, and it also helped with to give people an idea of how to go around the show, because there was no immediate, you wouldn't immediately know which way to go, and this certainly helped. So no, we were very conscious of the design of the show.
Sarah, if I can just add, I mentioned we walked through with the designers when I was a student, and I remember them talking a lot about this blue color, and how at least the designers claimed that the museum started with the idea of the kind of traditional white box gallery, and the designers at least said that they pushed, that they really pushed for this deeper palette that provided some contrast with the aluminum.
I slightly doubt that.
Maybe it was mutual.
But no, the designers really played a key role in the way the show looked.
I have another great question here from Rebecca Elliott at the Mint Museum, which is pretty funny, because in addition to stars like Madonna and Angelina Jolie, has anyone participating today actually sat on a Lockheed Lounge, and what is that like?
Yes, yeah. There used to be a Lockheed Lounge in the foyer of the Paramount Hotel.
Exactly.
In the 90s. There for anybody to sit on. The museum curator in me, I had to grit my teeth to try and to sit on this thing. And I did sit on it as a chaise longue. It was very uncomfortable, and not helped by the fact that I couldn't relax, and I was on it for all of about 10 seconds before.
I sat on that very one myself in the lobby in the late 1990s. We made frequent pilgrimages to look at it at the time.
Yes, me too.
I have not since then, actually.
I had heard that a large gentleman had sat on it as a chair, so he'd sat in the middle, where obviously you should not be putting weight, and had broken it, and then it was taken off you and restored, and then I think there was a realization of just how valuable this thing was, and so it didn't make it back to the foyer of the Paramount. So.
I have another question that has come in that is I do not personally know the answer to. Maybe the two of you do. It's from Marilyn Friedman, the historian in New York. Does anyone know of the existence or whereabouts of the furniture Raymond Hood presented at the Industrial Design Exhibition at the Met in 1929? I assume that's in aluminum too.
I don't, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Rachel, have you heard of anything of this? I have not.
I don't. I feel like I want to call a friend and ask Joel Stern.
Yeah. Seriously.
But right, I don't know if Marilyn and Jewel don't know. No, I don't know. I don't know. But I'll add it to the list of things that I'm always on the lookout for.
And that's part of the excitement of what we do, is kind of consistently making these new discoveries. Another question from Brittany at the Baltimore Museum. What surface condition, this is for either of you to answer, what surface condition should you look for when acquiring aluminum? What about polishing, corrosion issues? In terms of, she's looking at the Christoffel centerpiece surface imitation, for example.
Yeah, well, one of the advantages of aluminum is it's less corrosive than many other materials. So that isn't usually an issue. Some of the early aluminum, you may have noticed in some of the things which was shown, looks pitted. And I think that's really part of the production, that early production process. And then I think sort of how you treat, I remember a conservator at the time came up with a sort of way of cleaning aluminum that was not sort of super invasive and didn't destroy whatever patina there was. And of course, aluminum can be polished, it can be anodized. So they're also, the surfaces can look very different and be correct. Or be
I think I would say it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it depends on what it's intended to be, right? I mean, the Lockheed Lounge is polished. You know, there are other objects that have a satin finish. So I think, I don't know, I mean, I think in terms of acquiring for the museum, you know, the ideal finish is the one that is as close as possible to what was originally intended by the design maker.
I have a similar follow-up or a slightly different question, but again about surfaces. And this one is from Jody Harrow. I am presently making jewelry with aluminum being ideally lightweight and easy to bend without annealing. Can you address whether it has a negative effect on the skin or body?
As far as I know, it doesn't. I mean, there was a debate with aluminum pans as to whether they cause Alzheimer's, and the jury is, I think, still out on that. Oh, there's no scientific evidence either way. But in terms of jewelry, no, and so many jewelers do use aluminum. I would have thought that if there was an issue, that would have raised its head by this point.
And I think I have one final question here from Charlie Weissman. Why wasn't American-made repoussé aluminum given more exposure in the original exhibition, i.e. Wendell August, Arthur Armour, Palmer Smith? Some of these craft people were producing high-quality decorative aluminum well into the 1970s. I seem to remember Wendell August, though, in the show.
There were a couple of pieces of Wendell August, and there was an Arthur Armour repoussé tray. Oh, go back. Sorry.
I don't know if we can see it here.
Yeah, that's. Oh no. Oh yes, you can. That grill, the slide on the right, those gate panels, those are Wendell August Forge out of wrought aluminum, which really kicked Wendell August Forge off to then becoming the company that it ended up being and producing repoussé aluminum. And
they're a Pennsylvania company, correct?
They are, yes.
Right.
I mean, the problem is this was a broad brush show looking at aluminum internationally for 150 years. You know, we couldn't include everything. We tended to focus on a point of change or a point of introduction rather than a continuing history. But the aluminum took over the whole museum at this time, because we also had two other subsidiaries, smaller exhibitions at the museum while this show was on. One on aluminum architecture, I was put together by the Heinz Architectural Center. And then my colleague, Elizabeth Agro, did a show called Aluminuts, which was focused on collectors of aluminum, because there are some very keen collectors of aluminum, and particularly repoussé aluminum, things like Wendell August Forge and Arthur Armour. And so they were dealt with in depth, but in a different subsidiary exhibition.
Like people who collect Kensington ware, like
Kensington out of ware. I mean, we had a couple of pieces of Kensington ware. We had a couple of pieces of Russell Wright in the show, but you know, quite often people who collect it in depth, and that was what we dealt with in the Aluminuts show.
Fascinating. Well, I think that's it, folks. Thank you for all of those questions. And I can't thank the two of you enough for spending this hour with me, looking back on one of the great shows of the last 20 years. And Sarah, it's so good to see you and to have worked with you over the past week on this after many, many years. And except via like Instagram and things like that. So to everyone out there, thank you so much. We'll make this all available on YouTube and on our gallery's website and via the Carnegie Museum. That's how you can order that book as well. So to everybody out there, have a good one. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah.